On this day, the 2nd of February, 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed between the United States and Mexico. This came after a stunningly successful war for the United States and a catastrophic effort by the Mexicans to prevent the American victory. This would lead to half of Mexico being ceded to the United States. The United States establishing itself as one of the great powers in the world. Mexico had been an unstable state since its independence from Spain in 1821. There had been a decade of conflict that had led up to this, one in which had destabilized Mexico and had left it unprepared for a future of independence. Between 1821 and the war with the United States in 1846, Mexico had been in almost a constant state of near or actual civil war. Governments had been overthrown, there had been various juntas, there had been an emperor who had been overthrown and sent into exile. It was a bit of a mess. And the northern part of Mexico, what is now the southwestern part of the United States, Texas, as well as modern-day northern Mexico, was left to fend for itself. It was lightly populated. Places like California had very few actual Mexicans there, or Spaniards. Same was true of Texas and modern-day Sonora and Chihuahua, Nuevo León, and the various other provinces in New Mexico. They were basically uninhabited, except by the natives. And the United States, being the country that it was, being the country that was expanding, population growing rapidly, becoming wealthy, rich, and powerful, well, all that empty and unproductive land lay like a treasure waiting to be taken. Mexicans had been ignoring the northern part of Mexico for a long time. And they only made it worse when they started to invite American settlers to come into places such as Texas. These settlers very quickly decided that they would rather be a part of the United States. The Mexicans, in response, prohibited slavery in 1829 because they knew that that would upset the Texans on their plantations in the eastern part of Texas. And this led to the Texans rebelling against the Mexican government. This was going to lead to a disaster. Texas rose in rebellion against Mexico. And after capturing the Mexican general and later president, general and president again, and dictator, they made him agree to recognize Texan independence and that the Rio Grande would be the southern border of this new independent state. Now, he had done this because he had been a prisoner. Mexico and the Mexican government did not recognize this, did not recognize Texan independence, and definitely didn't recognize the border. They looked north towards a river, I don't know how to pronounce it, Nueces River. It's kind of halfway through Texas. I think it goes up towards modern-day Austin. Anyway, Texas then was annexed by the United States in 1845. And this set the scene for conflict with Mexico. Now, the United States had wanted to buy huge, amounts of Mexican territory for a long time. Andrew Jackson had tried and been rebuffed, and the British and the French had designs on California. It was a great land, it was empty. They especially liked the area around modern-day San Francisco, the Northern Valley area of California, because there was so much good soil, there was lots of water, good port, and Lord Palmerston had actually instructed the minister in Mexico to try to buy the territory. He wanted a British colony in California. Now, the Americans realized this, and they wanted to get there first. The French also had a bit of a design on California, but they never were seriously in contention there. But these territories were now up for grabs, and Mexico, they had fumbled. So the United States was looking for a reason to go to war, and this whole dispute over whether the Rio Grande or the Nueces River was the border gave President Polk the reason to go to war. So he sent Zachary Taylor, a very famous Zachary Taylor who later became president, to the border, and they were looking for trouble. So when the Mexicans refused to withdraw troops from that area, it ended up being a conflict and gave the United States its reason, its casus belli, to go to war. And here began the Mexican-American War. Suffice to say that the Mexican-American War was a very one-sided thing. The Americans invaded parts of Texas, they invaded New Mexico, they attacked California. The American Navy blockaded Veracruz. They took Veracruz and then marched towards Mexico City. They also embargoed the Pacific coasts of Mexico. Their fleet went around Cape Horn, and then blockaded Acapulco and various other smaller ports, and they helped in the Declaration of Independence of the California Republic, which then very quickly became American territory. So within 1 year and 9 months, Mexico was on its back, and the United States had its boot on Mexico's face. And there wasn't very much that Mexico could do. The Mexicans had tried to interest the British in aiding them to weaken the Americans, because the British and the Americans weren't the best friends at the time. However, just before this war, the British and Americans had decided on a border in the Oregon Territory. They'd split it between themselves. The British called it Columbia, the Americans Oregon, and British Columbia, well, it was British, and Oregon, the Oregon Territory, became American. So the border between the United States and Britain had been agreed. There was no reason for conflict. If that hadn't happened, the Americans may not have gone to war with the Mexicans, because they may have been worried about what would happen on their northern border. But the reason they decided to make a nice quick agreement was because they were looking to the south. So Britain wasn't going to help them, France wasn't going to help them, and there was no other power really that had any interest in helping them or had anything to gain. So Mexico was on its own. It had been crushed. Now, it was only to be seen what the Americans would demand of Mexico. There were people in the United States demanding the annexation of all of Mexico. There were others that wanted to annex even more of Mexico, including modern-day Sonora, Baja California, Chihuahua, Nuevo León, as well as Yucatan. So we don't really know at this point, the Mexicans didn't know, how bad this could go. Now, it was only time to wrap things up and make it legal. even though Mexico had been occupied by its enemy and it had been systemically taken apart militarily, Mexican government was reluctant to let go of California and New Mexico. And at the time, they were hoping that internal American problems and disagreements might let them off the hook, as it were. So in the United States, there were deep divisions between the North and the South, between Democrats and, I suppose, what would later become Republicans, as was Whigs at the time. And there were many Democrats that wanted the complete annexation of Mexico. However, President Polk had rejected that, his State of the Union address, upholding Mexican independence. The argument really was about how much to take. So Mexico was going to survive, but the Mexicans were hoping to keep as much territory as possible. I think they'd written off Texas at this point, but they were hoping to keep New Mexico and California. And New Mexico was pretty much not just modern-day New Mexico, but Arizona, Utah, most of Colorado, Nevada. So they were hoping to keep these two big chunks of territory, or at least keep as much as possible. Now, what the Mexicans did, they were trying to play the North and the South off against each other. They offered the northern part of California, as well as northern modern-day Nevada, Utah, and Colorado, because they realized that would be above the line that would cut the United States into slave states and free states, so the Missouri Compromise line. So they were trying to play internal American politics, and that was rejected, obviously, but they were hoping then that they could keep the southern part of California, and then modern-day New Mexico, Arizona, that sort of thing, the southern part of Nevada. It was a good play by them, very good. But unfortunately, Mexico couldn't really negotiate because it had no cards of its own. It wasn't like there was a stalemate. They had been completely crushed, completely and utterly. There was nothing that they could do, really, to negotiate with the Americans. They had nothing, no leverage. The only leverage they thought they had was internal American disagreements. And even that, the disagreements were real and would lead to civil war 12 years after this treaty. But Americans were still more united than the Mexicans thought. So, at this point, the negotiations began, and the Americans put to them that Alta California, so modern-day California, and Santa Fe de Nuevo Mexico, so that's New Mexico, Arizona, most of Colorado, Utah, Nevada, would become American. What the Americans did to try to soften the blow, they didn't mention the ceded territories, they just talked about the new border, and they described the new border. So the Rio Grande would be the southern border, and then there'd be a line going along what is the southern border of Nuevo Mexico at the time, which is a bit more north of the modern border because of the Gadsden Purchase. It would go along the Gila River, assuming it's pronounced the Gila, maybe Gia River, I don't know. And then it would get to the Californian border, and because they wanted the port of San Diego, they said 1 marine league south of San Diego, which is why it's so close to the border. I don't know why they just didn't take Baja California as well. That would have made more sense. But anyway, 1 league, 3 miles, so San Diego port, I assume, is 3 miles north of the Mexican border. So they did this, and, well, Mexicans didn't really have much choice in this. They just had to accept it. And they did get, $15 million at the time. Not very much money, but it was a lot more money back then than it is now. 15 million, when you throw around millions, it sounds like chump change today because we talk about trillions nowadays, or billions at least. So, but back then it was a lot of money. Mexican citizens, the very few that were living in the ceded territories, had a choice to become American citizens, or they could relocate. And if they did relocate, the Mexican government would grant them lands in Mexico. So overall, it was an excellent deal for the United States. They gained, 6 whole future states, as well as parts of another, 3 or 4 states. So this was a huge territory, and this war was a glorious little war for the United States, and it was the first expansionist war that they had fought against another power that actually had guns and armies properly. They had fought against Indians, that sort of thing. They had fought a war in 1812 with the British, but they had not fought a war like this ever before, and they had been astoundingly successful. After this treaty, a huge new area of land was opened up to American settlers. You all know about the 49ers. Once the gold rush in California began, in 1849, hundreds of thousands of people flocked to Northern California. The Mormons were already flocking to Utah, and would continue to do so, and become a very powerful and prosperous presence in that part of the world. Southern California would have to wait a bit longer, but in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, that too would boom. So, the United States now had a vast Pacific coast. It was now placed to become the most powerful country in the world. But it would have to get through its bloody civil war first. Some of the reasons for the civil war, they were kind of delayed, I think, by the Mexican War, because there was this brief moment where both North and South could be proud and united against a foreign enemy. They had won, they had conquered. But it didn't delay it that long, 12 years. Poor old Mexico. What happened to them? Well, there was more instability, there was more rebellions, more juntas, more dictatorships, which went on and on and on and on. Anyway, one thing that the Mexicans did start doing, they started settling the North. We forget that it wasn't just the Americans that were settling these territories, these dry desert territories now. Also the Mexicans. They started to send people from the densely populated area around Mexico City and on that plateau up north, towards Nuevo Leon, towards Monterrey, towards Sonora and Chihuahua, and even Baja California. They started sending people there, giving them lands, and that actually caused a lot of conflict with the natives up there. So the Indian Wars were not just a thing in the United States, they were also in Mexico. It's something we don't really hear about very, very often. So this would ensure that the United States wouldn't want to annex these territories anymore, because the Americans didn't want vast numbers of poor, illiterate, foreign peasants, really, in their countries. They were okay with a few hundred, a few thousand even, in the New Mexico territories and in California and in Texas, but hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions. That was the reason why the suggestion that all of Mexico should be annexed was rejected. People didn't want all these little Catholic Spanish-speaking foreigners being given equality with Americans, good Protestant white Americans. So settling these areas was actually a very clever move. It prevented the Americans from moving any further. Although there were a few attempts, there was some American adventurer, I can't remember his name now, but he tried to set up a little independent state in Sonora and in Baja California, and there's been a few eccentric Americans doing something similar in those waste areas of Mexico. But that couldn't happen now because it's all quite heavily populated, even the desert areas. So Mexico was spurred on to finally settle these territories. And now, well, I think they're almost irrevocably both American and Mexican now. Although there was at one time back in 1917, Zimmerman telegram, where the Germans were offering the Mexicans New Mexico, Arizona, and what else were they offering? Texas as well. They offered them those 3 states. They went to war with the United States. That didn't work. That kind of backfired on the Germans. To say one thing about the Germans, they just never seem to be able to get it right, do they? Anyway, so that's the story of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. A great moment for the United States, and perhaps not all that bad a moment for Mexico. Maybe it kind of spurred them on to actually take these territories, the ones that remained, seriously. Okay, if you like these videos, come back for more tomorrow. Subscribe, like, and leave a comment.